Okay, dear colleagues, dear friends, let us begin. This is a bit crowded. This is quite a company that we have today. I'm very glad to greet everyone. Good evening to some, good morning to others. Could I see? Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out the technical details. Just making sure I can see everybody. I am both excited and somewhat apprehensive about what's going to happen, but let us begin. My name is Sophia. And this is my first attempt to get together this tea time talk. You can all have your own cups. You're welcome to it. And hopefully this could be a start to maybe a series of meetings, similar meetings about Berdyaev, his heritage, his creative work. And I hope he can see us actually and rejoice that the revelation that God entrusted to him, not just for the Russian church, for the whole world, that it gets together one-minded people who have this common interest to God, to humanity, to human history, to philosophy, and life in general. Let me present some of the participants. Now, we are quite numerous today, but some people are listeners. These are mostly students or alumni of St. Philaret's Institute, which I've been a student of for the past 10 or 11 years. I have just completed my master's last year, and I'm very happy that there is such an interest in this topic. But I will only introduce those who sort of helped me in organizing this and in developing this idea, and to whom I'm really grateful. Olga Leontieva from Samara has joined us. Good evening. It's evening in Samara. Olga is the author of a book about Nicholas Berdyaev, about his historiosophy from Samara State University, and she is a PhD in philosophy, and I'm very happy that I'm hoping we can become friends. Margarita Shilkina, though I can't see her on my screen. Now I can see her, yes. She's also a PhD in philosophy and a professor and a dean of the School of Religious Studies at St. Philaret's. So she's also a high school professor who's had an encounter with Berdyaev, and this was like early on when she was making the first steps in her own faith. Professor Petros Vassiliadis from Thessaloniki, good evening. We've seen each other at many conferences, particularly those about ecclesiology, and not just in Moscow, in other places as well. And we're very happy, Professor, that you've been able to come today. Tsoncho, so good morning, Tsoncho. He's a PhD in theology and a teacher. And he defended his thesis last year at the University of Peter Mogila. And I'm very happy that he will join the discussion today. We have Tom Willett as well. Good morning to you, right? Is this morning?
It is morning, 9 a.m.
Том представитель музыкальной индустрии, не философ.
He represents the musical industry. He is not a philosopher, but he's also interested in life and what it means, and he has this idea of sharing what he learned from Berdyaev and what it means to be a human being and a creative human being, and to share that in people who are into creative arts, music, and so forth. And I think this is also an important mission, as it were. And unfortunately, I'm trying to see if everybody has joined. Father Andrei Brozovic, could you wave your hand for us? He's a Catholic priest from the movement of Centro Alessi, from a community of Centro Alessi in Rome, is completing his thesis at the moment about creative work as part of being sons of God. And this is his theme, also based on Berdyaev. Now, have I mentioned everybody? Can I see everybody? But I will still ask you if you could please introduce yourself very briefly anytime you speak, particularly for those who joined us later. We will have quite a few professors and students and people who have to deal with philosophy and theology professionally. But then there are, so to speak, amateurs, people who are still interested, even though not professionally. But Berdyaev did not consider himself a professional either. He felt it as a calling. There's one other person I think I must introduce, even though he's not here today. But he was at the core of this group. He can't use the modern technology just because of his age and health. It would have been hard for him to be here. Father Steve Janosch, a translator of Berdyaev's work into English, it's been a titanic job for him, particularly the early works of Berdyaev, making them accessible to the English-speaking and indeed the world public. And I'd like also to introduce Anna Aliyeva. Anna, could you wave to us? She chairs the Student and Alumni Association of our institute and has helped me organize the seminar. She's also, she teaches sociology and has a PhD in sociology. And also an approach and a certain point of view that she represents. Glad to see you. Now, time runs fast, so I'll move right on to a little presentation that I have prepared. It's hard because you want to be brief, but you want to at least make one thought clear.
Я хотела сегодня несколько слов сказать о том, что Николай Александрович Бердяев называет интегральным пониманием церкви.
I wanted to speak about what Berdyaev terms as integral understanding of the church, and the way he expounds it. He says this is talking about the church in its secret, in its mysterious nature. And some may be surprised that ecclesiology is one of the most important topics in his philosophy. This is like the main revelation, the main discovery he makes in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, at a time, indeed, when ecclesiology as a part of theology was being formed, was being born as a reality. Berdyaev is often seen as a sort of universal thinker and a representative of universal spirituality, and they forget that he felt very much part of the Russian church and the Russian culture, and it was he didn't feel that he was sort of part of anything in general. It was very much part of the Russian Orthodox tradition for him. And so what he expounded, the thought that he expounded was, it was very specific, very concrete, and what he calls personalism. This is the way he tried to understand life based on his own experience, except that experience isn't really partial or individual, it's very much universal in that sense. Just remember the way he interacted with the Orthodox circles here in Russia before exile, and before he left Russia, he went to a famous Russian priest and starets, Father Alexei Michov, whose spiritual sons were called Michovцы. These were very zealous Christians, and so he went to him for advice, and he said, "You leave because Europe needs to hear your voice," and that indeed is something that happened. And upon immigration, we all know the Orthodox work, this sort of social and charity organization, which was invented and headed by Mother Maria Skoptsova. This was also something that Berdyaev, the idea was his, and he was very much part of it. And Mother Maria, when she was writing the sort of main article, her editorial for her magazine, she sort of gave everybody careful instructions as to what they had to write about. But she said there were two people who could write about anything they liked. That was Berdyaev and Bulgakov. And even though these are people who, Berdyaev and Bulgakov are two people who are sometimes very sort of purposefully ignored by the official Orthodox, in the official Orthodox discourse, these are still people who've influenced the Orthodox thought all over the world. Father Bernhard Schultz from the Papal Oriental Institute said that Berdyaev's thought is permeated by ecclesiology, whatever he talks about. His book, Father Bernhard's book, was actually written at a time in 1938, at a time when Berdyaev was still alive. And while I would agree with this sort of assessment, I'd say that without this sort of ecclesial prospect, it's very hard to understand Berdyaev's thought. There's a certain barrier of spiritual experience, because he's not talking notions, he's not talking terminology, he's talking experience. It's not about style, it's not about words, even though he's got brilliant style and he's phrasing things very well, but it's about what he does as a philosopher. He's trying to appeal to a certain experience that people have. And the way he looks at the church has to do with this particular approach. He's not just looking at like different aspects, different teachings, different dogmas. He's changing the whole approach, the whole language. He speaks about the church, following Khomyakov and Solovyov. He says, this is not objective reality. This is not part of life. This is an experience of life, a certain depth of life. And because this is experiential, the human being comes to the fore. This is the Berdyaev's method. This is something that defines his whole thought. You need to trust man, trust the human being as the only part of God's creation to whom God reveals himself, to whom God reveals the truth, who actually has access to true knowledge. And this integral understanding of the church, now I know two texts where Berdyaev uses that verbatim. If you can find any more, I'd be very thankful if you tell me that there is more. The well-known article, Salvation and Creativity, and the Philosophy of the Free Spirit, the 10th chapter, which is called The Church and the World. And it's interesting the way he talks about, the church and the world is a fairly standard topic, and there are tens of articles. But what does Berdyaev do when he approaches that topic? He's not talking about two opposing objects, the good and the bad, the saved and the perishing, whatever. No, he's talking about the church as being the fullness of life, yet a life that is blessed, that is revealed as being rich, as being enriched by Christ. And he argues here with a very sort of narrow, but I think a dominating in many ways view of the church as like an aspect of life, an area of life that has to do with salvation, even sometimes personal salvation, your own individual salvation, which is a very partial and is a very sort of conservative understanding of the church that leaves behind perhaps the best and the broadest and the most beautiful part of human life, all the creative in it. He says many people think that interpreting Christianity as a religion of personal salvation is ecclesial, but in fact it goes against the very idea of the church. He may not be the only one, but I think Berdyaev is one of the first people who stated very clearly the notion of the church as a community, a fellowship of friends, of people who live according to their calling, not because they're afraid to die, they're afraid of eternal suffering, or even by awe to God, in relation to God, but people who are driven in a good sense by the desire to know the meaning of their own life and to follow it, to follow their calling. And he keeps repeating something that I think any Christian or whatever the church would agree with. He says, the church is a divine human body, but this is something we would all agree on. But he says, but being consistently and radically pursuing this thought in a radical and consistent way leads you into some things that are very problematic for people with a conservative mindset. When you speak about a divine human body, a divine human organism, it kind of like, were it divine, it would have been perfect. But because there is the human there, because there's a human nature, human freedom, human will, that sort of makes it slightly less perfect. And he disagrees with that. This is not something I can dwell upon at length, but now he receives the revelation of the fall in a very deep way. He has thought about it a lot, probably more than many. And he does not negate the consequences of the fall and the sin and the way it influences human life. But he cannot say that the human person is the cause of all problems in the church, because he says without the human being revealed in its fullness, without the calling of the human, without the creative part of the human, the church doesn't work. And even God cannot act in it. And even our understanding of God in this case, when your anthropology is thus limited, you can't really see God. If you can't see man as the image of God, you can't see God. And he's trying to clarify, to make it clear. Now, what does he do? He wants to follow through consistently on the revelation of divine humanity. And, this specific view of the church that he expounds on is something that has to do with this revelation of man, and this revelation of man as the image of God. Now, he believes that the patristic thought has been somewhat deficient in this. And the main thing, the main invention, as it were, to make this thought complete, this is the on-ground, this existential, this non-created freedom. I won't talk about it at length again, but I'll just mention that this is not just a notion, okay? And this is the way he speaks about it. He says it's a myth. It's a certain, again, it's part of experience, something that brings man and God closer together. This sort of uncreated freedom, Berdyaev opposes to the sort of scholastic discourse, the understanding of freedom as the freedom of choice. Because if you understand freedom as the freedom of choice between good and evil, this whole concept of the church is based on that, because it's important because of human presence in it. Berdyaev says, no, freedom is not about choice. Now, there is a freedom of choice, naturally, about in relation to law, in relation to good and evil, but this is a fallen freedom. This is the freedom that we find in the world after the fall, but the original freedom, the one that makes man like God. He says it's a force, it's a power, it's a potential, and you can't sort of narrow it down to the right or the wrong answers. And God, in his all-knowing, sort of kind of gives you the choice, but there is the right and the wrong choices there. But that's something. This is not. This is creative. This is powerful. This is not me choosing between objective good and evil that's given to me. This is me creating good, creating evil. This is me working it out on my own. And therefore, man becomes a creator. And Berdyaev uses this image, of a shining nature. And why this is so hard? This is so hard to understand, because in the fallen world, we are so used to looking at a person as a consumer. My freedom ends where another person's freedom begins. You're sort of a consumer, a user of freedom. But Berdyaev says this is fallen ethics. This is ethics coming from within the law, and it is not complete. It is not it's finite. But God, that he says that man has created, was created by God as somebody who has the potential to want that freedom, not just for himself, but for his neighbor as well, and can give freedom, grant freedom by living out his calling, his creative calling. And so he's trying to show this affinity between God and man, this likeness. And therefore, the church, understood thus as divine humanity, becomes a mystery rooted in two types of freedom, the divine freedom and the human freedom. And it's not like one is right and the other is wrong, or one is perfect and the other is imperfect, but these are two impenetrable mysteries. And he uses the word impenetrable because he says that man is a mystery to God, almost as much as God is a mystery to man. It's impenetrable. And it makes the whole context more open, more unpredictable. He says, and for the church specifically, he says the church does not have a layout, a plan. You know, we kind of, you know, by ages of history, you know, the church is set up in a certain way. There's patriarchates, there's local churches, there's dioceses, there's all this, that, and the other. And we're so used to it. But Berdyaev pushes us towards seeing in the different ways of, and the different levels the church is organized and in the different forms that it takes, to see this as a creative invention of man. You know, this is the way Paul thought about it, or St. Paul, and this is somebody else, you know, some other apostle thought of it in this way. He is talking about, you know, we have all of these models about St. Peter's ecclesiology, St. Paul's ecclesiology, St. John's. He's trying to free our mind to look at the church not as something that is sort of standardized and defined by norms, and, you know, and once you deny the letter and the form, then you deny everything. There's a parallel here with Vladimir Solovyov, who also thought about the church as divine humanity and also had this integral, in a way, approach to it. But for Solovyov, the dark double, as it were, would be the human divinity, as it were. For Berdyaev, maybe the hardest, the most scary false image is a divine angel. This is the divine angelic nature, where you try to replace with the mysterious, the impenetrable, the risky and the free human nature, which has made the fall possible and all the tragedy of human history, but replace it with something more stable, more safe, something safer, something that will work. And there's a ton of examples in history, you know, this sort of magic, superstitious understanding and the sacraments and the rites. And, you know, if you do everything right, you know, get the hierarchy right, you use the right form, it will work, whether the person is there or not, whether the human being is there or not, whether they understand or not. But unfortunately, I don't know how many people would share that point, but unfortunately, in a very sort of natural way, people are prepared to give the church up, as it were, to this external order, this external organization, removing the human person, removing the scary, the free, the risky element. some people, talk about even the sermon sort of disrupting the worship service. Berdyaev sort of tries to free up our understanding of the church and the human being. And there's a lot of things that follow from that. And whichever you touch, whichever topic you could probably have a separate discussion on every one of them. But just to name a few, some of the important ones, consequences. He says, he speaks about the monophysite understanding of the church, where the divine nature is accepted and the human is somehow lessened. This is monophysite, and he says it prevents the fellowship of people in love as a positive content of ecclesial life. It is individualistic and asocial. He talks about sobornost. He says ecclesial experience has to do with sobornost as an ontological quality of the church. In the experience of the church, I'm not one, I'm with all my brothers in the spirit, all those who lived at any time and in any place. He says the church is an experience of overcoming division like that. And this is the way a certain eschatological dimension appears. Because what is eschatology after all? This is a very sort of healthy world view, as it were. Looking at history from the eschatological perspective, it's a person who is not oppressed by history. It's something too great, too big, and something you can't influence. He says in a normal situation, a human being is greater than history. It has to do, because it has to do with a human being, not a number of years or centuries or generations. And in Berdyaev's world, the eschatology in Christianity and eschatology in the church, it's not an aspect. It's not a part of the theological system. This is something that enters this world with the incarnation of the divine human person, the incarnation of Christ. And that gives the true scope, the true stature of man. The church is eschatological by nature. It's a phenomenon. It's an eschatological phenomenon that gives the human being its true stature, its true freedom. This has to do with the three ethics. I'll probably stop there. I'll just mention the three ethics and stop here. He says just as the forms and the way of organization is not something that's prescribed for the church, in the same way, the principles of the way people relate to each other, because obviously the church is a space where people fellowship with, where they relate to each other. This is not static. There's no eternal ethics, sort of all-time ethics. I think we keep hearing the arguments about the new ethics and what is the old ethics, and do you just throw it away? Berdyaev, in his turn, says that the church ethics is not the ethics of law. He argues with this understanding of the church as a harbor for those who are being saved, as a mini sect, as it were, where people see themselves as being saved. But he also argues with the understanding of the church as a ghetto for good people. The good people sort of where they put a separation between them and the bad people. And in that sense, the ethics of the law, talk about the 10 Commandments or the biblical ethics or the secular ethics, indeed, which is again based on the law, at least in principle, the same principles, where my freedom ends, the freedom of the other person begins. It's probably one of the first inventions in the ethical history of humanity, where people sort of learn to coexist, to live and not to destroy the life of others, and sort of find these elementary laws of common life, community life. But his ethics begins, his ecclesiology begins with redemption. He says, if you talk about freedom, he says, my freedom does not exist without the freedom of the other. It demands the freedom for the other. It requires the salvation of this world from evil, starting with those nearest to me, with my neighbor. So this is a lot more community in that ethics. There's not a lot more overcoming the divisions, the alienation between God and man, and God and people, between people. And he also talks about the ethics of creativity. He says the ecclesial ethics, the New Testament ethics, starts where this unique calling of man comes into play, what he lives for, something that is greater than he is. And there are difficulties there. There are some things that clash. Every ethics has clashes, has conflicts. Even, St. Paul talks about, the law does not empower me to live it out. And the law is basically it does not relate to man. It doesn't love anyone. It doesn't love the reasons. It's like this blind justice. The ethics of redemption tries to overcome that limit. It tries to see the human being, to see the neighbor, but it also has its own limits and has a tragedy within it, because the ethics of redemption wants to overcome the very division between the good and the evil, which is impossible. And the more creative and the more community-based ethics of creativity has to do with a lot of risk, the highest possible risk perhaps, because at a certain point you run against values that are higher than your own, like your personal calling can come into collision with your family or with the notions of those nearest and dearest to him, and these conflicts of the higher values. This is a place where you can't find the right answer. Nobody can tell you the right answer, not even God. So Berdyaev poses this as a problem. He says that this type of ethics may be seen as relative, that there is a danger of relativism there, where the person is basically left to decide which is the high value. But this is also Berdyaev's anthropology and ecclesiology in its most unique way. It's a very open space, as it were, where both man and God can be created. He says in the church, there's a tragic deficiency in God that is being replenished by man coming into that world. And this is the mystery of Christianity, and this is the mystery of Christ. God and man together are greater than God on his own. And this is Berdyaev's thought, maybe one of the greatest. He says, God is not an administrator of the universal whole. He is the meaning of human life. He basically questions God as the sort of stereotype God Almighty who can do anything. Berdyaev is not anything. And the only thing that you can respond to that is that it doesn't make God limited in any way. It doesn't make his power any lesser. just gives you a different understanding, perhaps, of his power. That God creates man. He uses the word microtheos, the mini God. He kind of creates a second God. And he even remembers, and there was a Russian philosopher, Grigory Skovoroda, who said, God is not created. God is closer. Man is closer to creator than creation. And in that sense, you know, if God takes this type of risk, creating this type of mini God, and not just, and after the fall, not to give up on the whole project, really makes God's power, it makes you see God's power in a very different way. And the revelation of that is the church in our world. I have to stop here because time runs so fast, and I could probably speak a lot more, but I would welcome questions, and I would invite you all to discuss, to augment, to argue, whatever. Now, I would suggest that if you want to speak, please let me know in the chat, okay? Just let me know that, you know, raise your hand in the chat that you want to speak. Or say it. Obviously, I'm asking in the first instance, not the students, but those of you who are part of the research team, as it were. Those of you who have thought about these topics and maybe you would like to add or argue. I know Dmitry wants to speak. Yes, thank you. But I'll be driving a bit later on, so I'm using this time and I may not get another chance. So I'm sorry. We've talked with Sophia before about particularly this presentation she wanted to make today and earlier on, and we've talked to others, and we even tried to study English using Berdyaev's text. We even tried to study Russian with some of the English speakers. It's a great method because he uses very sort of short, simple sentences.
Алло.
Я слышно, да.
Может быть, без
Меня
видео.
слышно?
Пропадаешь.
Ага, без видео. Так, я
Okay, I'll just give up the video and maybe you can hear me better that way. So what I wanted to say was that Berdyaev has these wonderful, simple, not primitive, but very interesting and brief texts, so much so that you can even study Russian using his texts. But the question I have, see, I was thinking as I was listening to you that, you know, when I first read Berdyaev, I was not a person, I was not in the church yet. I was basically sort of in my last years at university, and I was reading his book, and the first one was on Dostoevsky, and maybe I didn't understand 50% or even more, but I liked it nevertheless. Now I understand more. And then there are people who don't like him. Some people, you know, start reading him, they say, wow. And there are others who say, he's not a philosopher, he's not a theologian, we don't like him. Now, how do you check? Can you hear me? Yeah. Now, how do you find out what he says is true or not. I mean, it may sound naive, but I'd like for Sonia to dwell upon this a little bit, because you have to have a criteria, right? In the wonderful words that he says, the amazing thoughts that he says that he has about human nature, about ethics and so on. How do you verify that? Can you? Would anybody like to speak on that? Dmitry didn't introduce himself. I'm sorry.
Сонь, да, сейчас я учусь в общецерковной
I'm sorry. I'm in the postgraduate program and I'm working on a theology on a thesis in theology about the boundaries in the church, the understanding of the boundaries of the church in the dialogue between the Anglican and the Orthodox Church. And Berdyaev was obviously very much a part of, well, he was obviously very aware of this dialogue and even took part in some of that dialogue. So this is, and I'm an interpreter by profession. So this is, and I'm doing this. And so Dmitry is asking about criteria, about verification, about, how do you find out if what Berdyaev says is true, basically? Okay, would anybody like to Professor Vlasyevsky, would you like to speak?
Since the previous, let me first of all congratulate you about this evening's, for me, meeting about Berdyaev connected with ecclesiology and the whole project St. Philaret has produced in the past, say, 10 years or so. Since the previous question was about the Anglican Orthodox relations or dialogue, let me, since it is a tea time relaxed discussion, to present to you and to the audience the so-called Greek version of the Berdyaev personality and his thoughts. It is quite interesting that the Greek-speaking milieu started being aware of the Russian diaspora theological project for renewing the church quite late, probably
Professor, we have lost you, I'm afraid.
Извините, мы по-английски будем слушать.
Да, дорогие друзья, коллеги, кто вдруг не слышал то, что сейчас говорил профессор Петрос Василядис по причине, в общем, кто не слышал, тот, скорее всего, не включил перевод на русский язык. Это нужно сделать на кнопочке внизу на панели Zoom.
Yes, you are. I can hear you again.
Да.
Okay.
Yes, you are. Yeah, yeah.
However, immediately after the Second World War, there was an intelligent hierarch, Metropolitan Irenei of Samos, who translated Berdyaev's work around 1950. And the translated word of Berdyaev came from the official publishing house of the Church of Greece. It was about the destination of human being, and then a few others. And during the next decades, quite a lot of works by Berdyaev were translated by colleagues of mine at the University of Thessaloniki. However, at the same time, there was a quarrel, a spiritual discussion between Metropolitan of Thessaloniki, for whom we have dedicated the Center of Ecumenical, Missiological, and Environmental Studies, and Metropolitan Irinei. This discussion about these two intelligent hierarchs was about the participation of the Church of Greece in the ecumenical movement, or the way the representation of the Church should be in such a ecumenical forum, like the World Council of Churches or the others later, the Council of European Churches and so on. Metropolitan Irinei, who translated and introduced, let's say, the Russian philosophical thinking into the Greek theological world, was against this participation in the ecumenical movement, probably because of his connection with the great Russian personalities in the diaspora. He was aware of the 1948 meeting of some churches to reject the participation of the Orthodox in the ecumenical movement. Of course, more than, in 2 decades, the whole of Orthodox world became part of this. Now, this is one aspect. The second aspect, and Metropolitan Panteleimon actually won this struggle, Church of Greece struggle about the participation of the Orthodox Church into the ecumenical movement. The second reason why this is this kind of rehabilitation of Berdyaev and also Sergei Bulgakov is that for 2 or 3 or 4 decades, the overall Orthodox theological thinking was around let's say, the other part, the other trend, represented by Florovsky and the others. And now it was time to revive this kind of more ethical, more open ecclesiologically understanding of our Orthodox faith through a new kind of, I would label it as a prophetic understanding of the Orthodox Church, in addition to the so-called patristic and old-fashioned understanding of the institutional church, and also the so-called Eucharistic ecclesiology, the prophetic dimension of the Church of Christ, the Orthodox theology, was important to be rehabilitated. And it is timing, as I said, because now these days a lot of discussion on the theological level is taking place, just to bring again to the fore what was missing for the past, say, 30 or 40 years. So this is the Greek, let's say, perspective of the Berdyaev, and in a way through Berdyaev, Bulgakov's ideas and approach to Orthodox ecclesiology in a more open, I would say, beyond the boundaries, the canonical boundaries of the church. And of course, it was also Father George Florovsky, the late George Florovsky, who indicated the importance of thinking ecclesiologically beyond our canonical boundaries, but as a system, as a paradigm, the theological thinking, this prophetical theological thinking of these figures, and I would add also one from my own country, Professor Agouridis. Most of his writings has made an appeal, an extraordinary appeal to the society, but not to the ecclesiastical circles. And now it is time, I think, these great figures who not contradict, but add another more ethical element to the overall Orthodox theological thinking and to our ecclesiology should be brought into the our consideration. So this is what I wanted to share to this evening tea meeting from the perspective and the history of Berdyaev in Greece. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Огромное спасибо, Петрос. Действительно,
Thank you indeed. Petros, indeed, the book about the calling of man, is so good that it was translated into Greek. It's good to know because that you can find people knowing, people in Greece knowing these important figures and these important works of them. I think Natalia wanted to speak. I can't see everybody, unfortunately, but on my screen.
Good evening. One moment. I don't know. I can put on the video. Okay. So, good evening or good morning to everyone. Here we are from Ukraine, but it's easier for us to speak English, maybe not perfectly, but in any way. And I am the student in Krakow University, and maybe you know Sister Teresa Obolevich. Maybe some of you knows her. She is my supervisor, and I'm a PhD student in Krakow, and I write my dissertation exactly, which is devoted to one of the idea of Berdyaev, it's his personalism. And here's my husband. He also would like to say something because he is an intelligent man. So thank you very much for your presentation. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. So, and indeed, I would like to add something. Indeed, it's impossible to speak about ecclesiology in Berdyaev's philosophy and to separate man, God and man. And we can find many definitions in Berdyaev's philosophy of the church, his definition. But one of the definitions, he said that church is a unity of the world soul and Christ Logos. And the world soul is exactly, of course, he speaks about humanity. And also, it's hard to speak about his personalism and also separate ecclesiology, his idea about the church, because human can be transfigured only in the church, and only if he is as a person, if man is a person. There is no place in the church for the individual. And here we also can mention his idea about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. He took it from sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies, who very first time in the Europe speaks about, he puts under the question the idea of progressiveness of society. And Berdyaev also, he took from him this idea about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So Gemeinschaft is a community and Gesellschaft, it's let's say social reality. And in social reality, we can find only the individuals. But when we speak about community and especially about the church, so here we can find only like the person. So that's why it's impossible to become a person and to be not to be the member, the part of the church, not to be the part of Christ's body. So that's all.
Спасибо, Наталья. Ну, действительно,
Thank you, Natalia. Indeed, Berdyaev's anthropology is something that deserves a separate discussion, and his concept of objectivation and so on. That's something that you need to perhaps talk about separately. But there was somebody else who wanted to speak. If I may give the floor to Oleg Glagolev. I think Alexander wanted to speak, and I think his hand came first. Sorry, some people are writing personal messages, others are writing in the chat. So can I speak? I'd like to just thank Sophia for her presentation and to maybe continue on the topic of Dmitry that Dmitry raised, and also to thank Petros Vassiliadis for the prophetic dimension that he mentioned. And you know, some say that, you know, prophet can only be understood by the prophet. You know, and in that sense, you know, how do you understand whether what Berdyaev says is true? You could ask another question: why, to this day, why today? Because as Sonia says, there was a different attitude to Berdyaev's word while he was still alive. Perhaps some people took him a bit more seriously, and even in the church. And Father Alexei Michov, who sent Nicholas Berdyaev and gave his blessing for him to go to Europe, he actually called him Father Nicholas. So he was a bit of a joke, but it was a standing joke, and so he called him as though he were a priest. Now, why is his word so important? Why it feels so important for Christians to respond, to react to that word? Why, you know, Petrus, Professor Vassiliadis was saying, because it's prophetic for our time. It is important to help us define the boundaries of the church, and Dmitry Doroshko is, of course, into this, all of these boundaries in ecclesiology. But you know what Berdyaev says is that these boundaries have to be somehow more related to the human person, to all of his desires, desire for freedom, that you cannot fail in his calling, and it cannot be just partial. And it is very important for the church. You know, this is what the church is for. It's not just there. It's there for the man to live out his calling. This is why man was created, and for the human person to fulfill that calling is essential, and the church is there to help. That's the only reason for it to be there at all. And so it's a great thing that we started this discussion, and there should be more of discussions like that, because this tone, this prophetic tone that he sets, talking about the human person and the calling and the creative calling of the human being, about, you know, the church cannot live its life in fear and trying to save itself. I think we need to hear that very seriously. I'm sorry for being a bit proclamational here, but this is what I wanted to say, that Nicholas Berdyaev really brings together people who are called by God, people who love his word, who hear what he has to say, to hear what God has to say through Berdyaev. And we need to talk to those around us about this. Now, we spoke today, for instance, mentioned the new ethics, but the real Orthodox word, the real Christian word, the real Christian ethics is something that Berdyaev started. So again, thank you, everybody. And you didn't introduce yourself. I'm a journalist. I'm Oleg Glagkoev. We have a media project which is called Stall, and I'm from Yekaterinburg, from the Minor Brotherhood on Saint Elizabeth. Alexander Korolev wanted to speak also. Good evening again to everybody, and again, thank you, Sonia, for this great discussion. My name is Alexander Korolev, and I'm also part of the same brotherhood from the city of Nizhny Vartovsk, far away in Siberia, and I work as a school teacher. I'll try to phrase my thoughts as briefly as possible. There are basically two views of the church. Again, I'm trying to continue what Oleg started. There's the preservational one and the prophetic one. The preservational one is like everything is given, everything is there. So our task is, what the fathers set up many years ago at the councils. We need to preserve and pass on without losing any of that. That's one approach. The other approach is that revelation is alive. It's there, it becomes deeper, it develops, and Christ didn't give us a matrix, but he gave us this impulse, and that new things need to be created. And in that sense, there are both brilliant revelations, thoughts of genius, and at the same time, there are reductions, there are limitations. So the monophysite approach, for instance, that he expounds on, this is an example of this sort of reduction, which prevails in the contemporary Orthodox thinking. And Father Sergius Bulgakov, a close friend of Nicholas Berdyaevs, used to say, he said, there's no Trinitarian view in the church, because the Trinity has not been, and Christology has not really been developed. So there's no teaching of the church that is properly developed on these key doctrines. And when Father Sergius Bulgakov tries to speak about Trinitology and about pneumatology, about the Holy Spirit, whereas Berdyaev sort of deepened the revelation and indeed maybe discovered it for the first time in many ways, the revelation of the human being. A lot has been said about God, not enough has been said about the human being. And there was this is what he used to call the anthropological pessimism, that a sort of understanding of man as being sinless, and the only thing you can do is to be saved, and shouldn't see himself in any other way. So this is a very new and a very prophetic word in that sense. And I do believe that this is universal, that in that sense it is universal. The Lord builds up his church through us, through the people in the church. And I do believe that Berdyaev, just like some other people from the Russian religious philosophy, these are people through whom this renewal, this new prophetical word happened, and it should help renew certain meanings, certain concepts. This is something that should help for the church find a new beginning, a new life after the end of the Constantinian era. And if you want the church to be contemporary, we want it to deal with the contemporary challenges. You don't want it to be sort of going back to the 16th, 17th century and try and relate to the questions that were asked then, and to look like people from the antique shop. you need to be contemporary, you need to be current, you need to be answering the questions philosophy is posing today. Olga Borisova wanted, and then Soncha Sonchev, and okay. Thank you, Sophia. I'd like to thank her, Sophia, for setting the tone and sort of mentioning some of the key notions in freedom, ethics, and the new ethics, not just ecclesiology, but eschatology as well. And dear friends, dear colleagues, I'd like to say a few words how I see these problems as a historian. Now, I was introduced earlier, but I'm Olga Leontieva, and I'm a historian, and I work in the university in Samara. Just yesterday, around the same time, I was at another roundtable discussion, also an online discussion about what was called Russian Narodnichestvo. And it just so happens that there was this movement of Narodniki people, they tried to propose a theory for the development of Russia. And they, in many ways, many of them took part in the revolution and preparing it, and some of them even were revolutionaries and terrorists. But somehow all the participants of the discussion agreed that they tried to create a new ethics, a more rationalist ethics. And it was very necessary at the time, whether we like it or not. But after the end of the serfdom in Russia, it was important to go back to the ethical issues and to rethink ethics in Russia. And Konstantin Mikhailovsky, who was the head of that movement, and Berdyaev argued with that very much. He was very much against that ethics. They were looking for truth in its earthly sense. And he said they were not thinking about truth in its highest, in its divine sense. And it is interesting to look at what Berdyaev did from the prospect of these ethical search and looking for new forms of community and communion and fellowship. You know, all of the Russian intelligentsia of the Silver Age, as it was called, in the early 20th century, they were all looking for new forms. There was the Merezhkovsky and the Gippius with their new religious philosophy group meetings. There was the new religious philosophy society in memory of Vladimir Solovyov and a number of other initiatives. And for their generation, 1917 definitely became a historic catastrophe and a failure for all of their hopes that there'd be a new life, a new inspiration for Russian intelligentsia, Russian thought, that there would be a new religiosity, a new wave of religious thinking. And this was a tragedy for them. A lot of people here remembered Sergei Bulgakov, who was a friend of Nicholas Berdyaev, but in 1917, he gave up his philosophical world. He became a priest. He stopped being a thinker as a philosopher in the secular sense of the word. And Berdyaev built his philosophy around this sort of attempt to think about these historic catastrophes. He says every great era always tries to be eternal, but every time they fail, they're overturned by these historic catastrophes that take place. Obviously, you know, we're people of different generations and we have different experience, but we've seen a few of those catastrophes, haven't we? You know, the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist system. We've gone through 9/11, and you know, a few hours where the world felt it was never going to be the same again. In 2020, you know, there's a new challenge that the world faces, and things that used to feel stable and there, and you know, with this COVID-19, again, it's a challenge and in a sense a historic catastrophe. And to me, Berdyaev has always been attractive because he was so good at showing what a man can do when he goes through a historic catastrophe like that, how you can sort of start building anew. I love the last chapter in his book where he says, he talks about the force of memory, the renewing force of memory that overcomes time and death. And he brings memory and creativity together, because memory is not mechanical reproduction. This is not restoring something that was before. Memory is something, is a transformational force. It's the breath of a new life. And looking for new forms of creativity, restoring and reviving things that deserve to be revived, trying to bring together these ties of time. These are the problems that many people thought about. Just quoted Chadaev and Mandelstam. But this is something that many people thought about, and this is a challenge for us as well. And maybe it is very good and very valuable that we can remember Nicholas Berdyaev, and this discussion and communion and fellowship that we're having is something that he would have liked, I dare say. So thank you very much. Toncham, would you like to
Hello, everyone.
join?
The conversation is very interesting. I really enjoying. I want to say only a few words on a few notes. I agree with Professor Vasilidis about new prophetic understanding. In the last years, when I started to study Berdyaev, I noticed, I'm not sure whether my connection is good. Is it okay? The connection. Yeah,
it's not perfect.
Okay.
But we can hear you.
I agree with Professor Vasilidis that there is need for a new prophetic understanding that we can learn from Bulgakov, Berdyaev, Merezhkovsky, and all these exiles who felt how to live in difficult times, and who, like Mother Maria also, and who suffered like as Christians. It's very easy for us to speak from our cozy homes and from academy and from all these good environments. COVID is a big tragedy for us, according to the media, and it's tragedy. But these people had a very strong experience. My wife is coming, so sorry. These people had a real experience from which we can learn. And they're the bearers of the true prophetic spirit. Olga Leontieva said that Berdyaev tried to understand history. He was a philosopher of history. I'm completely agree. And I remember that, and he spoke about division, that the Russian Narodniki tried to save Russia, and saving Russia, they actually destroyed it. And this leads me to the question of the church. According to Berdyaev, I read Berdyaev's understanding of church as I read Khomyakov's understanding of church. Berdyaev was very influenced by Khomyakov, and Khomyakov was speaking about silent agreement that the church is one. And this was one of the this is how I understand the church in Berdyaev. This is the silent agreement, wrong and what is not. I'll read John, which is related to the centrality of man. According to Berdyaev, God has given man full freedom, so full that God himself does not know what man will do with this freedom. It is paradoxical, but man is a mystery even for God, for his creator. But the creator knows that his creation is good, so good that he puts his trust in his faith, not just his will in it. Man cannot trust man, as we know from Jeremiah, but God, his creator, can and does. The creator endowed his creation, this is man, with dignity equal to the dignity of God himself. And only through such dignity, God can be born in man and man in God. This exaltation of individual human dignity, in this exaltation, which we find in Berdyaev, we discover traces of the mystical poetry of Silesius. I don't know whether you know him. Berdyaev knew Silesius very well, and he quoted him, I know that God cannot live one instant without me, wrote Silesius. If I should come to naught, needs must he cease to be. And also now is, but I and two were, they are not two and I. In other words, there is a bond of coexistence and communion of divine and human. And we find the concrete man as a center of all existence. This is according to Berdyaev's vision, this is Berdyaev's personalism. Man is an indispensable element of life, without which nothing, not even God, would be possible. This is also a Solovyovian understanding. This vision says that if I die, or you, the entire world dies with me. If you die, an entire world dies with you. And what will be left from the world if I am not, or you are not? If God dies, Christ, then we all die. So this is what I want to say, that the human person is very thorough, and we cannot have neither church, even not God, in this vision, if there is a man. And this is the root, in my opinion, of Berdyaev's personalism. Yeah, this is what it's a little bit confused, but this is what I wanted to say.
Да, большое спасибо. Я сейчас передам слово Александру.
Thank you very much indeed. But I do want to react to what I just heard. Thank you, Sonja, very much. See, on the one hand, true, Khomyakov and Solovyov are in Berdyaev in many ways follows them. But I do want to add that Berdyaev himself sees in the thought of Khomyakov not so much a deficiency because he is so respectful of him, but he kind of sees it as a bit incomplete. He says that Khomyakov in particular, that he had this intuition of a genius, of the church being a space of freedom and communion, that he really saw some things he saw very well. And this whole notion of soborness is a notion of genius and a revelation. But I think the word eschatology here, the way Berdyaev uses it, in his opinion, Khomyakov lacked this sense of eschatology, meaning that you could feel the tragedy of history and the fallenness of the world. Berdyaev has this idea of disintegration in the world. And this is probably my favorite quote from Berdyaev. He says a great sign of the fall of man is that he receives light from the sun and his life revolves around the sun, but he is called to be the sun to this world, whereas he's called to be. So he's kind of fallen away from the calling to be the sun of this world and has fallen into darkness. And thank you for sort of getting together, helping to put together the thoughts that I was trying to bring in my initial presentation. This is the integral view of the human being that is important. And also what he said about the suffering that they went through, you know, as they lived in exile. I'd like to have a parallel with the other, as it were, part of the Russian church that stayed here in Russia, the new martyrs and confessors. And again, this is not something that I've come up with, but I share the thought that these are like two sleeves of the same tradition, you know, the immigration and the people from exile and the new martyrs and confessors, and they had the fullness of experience of suffering and the same eschatology, the same sort of notion of eschatology, and there's this prophetic notion of this world. These are kind of two sides of the same coin. I could probably speak a lot more on this, but I want to give others a chance. Alexander Volkov has been asking to speak for a long time, so I'm sorry for not letting him do that. Alexander, well, Sonia has already introduced me. I'm Alexander Volkov. I'm currently a PhD student in Moscow State University in the School of Philosophy, and I'm also interested in Berdyaev. I'm also part of the Russian Transfiguration Brotherhood. And there was a lot has been said that Berdyaev has not really been appreciated, duly appreciated, and that have not been studied properly, particularly his ecclesiology. His personalism, yes, his kind of philosophical works to a certain degree. Some people have tried to look at that, but ecclesiology, the key thing, the backbone of his thought, has not really been studied properly, and maybe these tea time discussions will make a little bit of a step towards studying that. I've always been interested in looking at, you know, when did he start being bothered by this whole question of the church? Because you know, in the early 20th century, you know, the problems of idealism. He's talking about sort of the general Christian outlook. He's thinking about Christianity at large, okay? And he's talking about idealism. Now, the church became something of a poignant issue for him, I think, in 1907. And I think it had to do with his moving to Moscow, because between 1905 1907, he was participating, you know, in these Wednesday meetings with Vyacheslav Ivanov. They were talking about culture. He was close to the circles of the new religious thinking. So he's talking about, they were talking about intelligentsia, they were talking about mystical issues like the third covenant. So there was this kind of spiritual environment in the church, in very much in terms of what Solovyev was thinking about divine humanity, and they discussed them and discussed them a lot. But the church and the historic church, the Orthodox Church, when did he become affirmed that just a sort of mystical environment was not enough? He was writing in 1907 to Zinaida Gibbs. He cannot agree with her because that the church, that the issue of the church that they were raising seems to be a temptation to him, that they're not accepting the church, the living church as it is alive here and now, and that the Moscow circles are sort of more orthodox, and that there was Valentin Svetsky, the future Father Valentin, the future priest, Vladimir Ern, who unfortunately died quite early. Father Pavel Florensky was also part of that Moscow circle, and Sergius Bulgakov, you know, not yet priest at the time. So this is a whole generation of people who were very much Orthodox, even though Sergius Bulgakov was before 1907, 1906, was more sort of interested in issues of society, politics, and so on. But this drive in them for thinking about historic orthodoxy and to understand that, it really forced him to think about the church here and now as it is. Now, he didn't quite become a part of this circle. He also argued with them. He also had discussions and debates. There was an article in this magazine Vehi, and they had this sort of disagreement there, specifically about the church. He said Svetsky has this tendency to justify everything by the sacraments, that the church for him is, you know, asceticism, the early centuries asceticism, and the church as what it preserves in the sacraments, and he seems to justify the sort of contemporary life of the church, despite the fact that there have been quite a few crises historically, and there were a lot of challenges. He kind of sees that as too radical. And the people with the new religious thinking, they too, the philosophers and the Merezhkovskys, they do not acknowledge the historicity of the church, and that they're sort of proponents on their subjective and cultural view of the church. And I think this is the start. This period is the start for Berdyaev to have this image of the church, to begin to have this image of the church. He starts thinking about the universal church. He starts analyzing the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and he finds more kind of positive things, of course, in the Orthodox Church. Though after Vatican II, I think Berdyaev, the Catholics actually learned more and appropriated more of Berdyaev's heritage. He also wrote, you know, this article about Nismelov, which he called an exercise in justifying Christianity. So he says that Christian anthropology has not really been studied by anybody. And then Nismelov, who was just a professor at a seminary in Kazan, and that he is right on the point there, that the whole issue of the human being, the tragic life and the whole tragedy of the human life, that is the point, that is the critical point, that he is right in this. I could speak a lot about this, but I think it's very interesting to see the way Berdyaev's ecclesiology evolved, because we tend to sort of speak about the later stages where, but how did he come up with that? When did he sort of become part of the church, where he became and he become a parishioner, start taking communion and become part of the historic church in that sense, in the fullness. I know he met with the starets and went to Optina and so on, but he found a lot of deficiencies there as well. But he seemed to initially sort of avoid the actual real life of the church. And yet when he goes to Michov for advice, it is very much as a person who's part of the church, who's very much rooted in the church. But when did it happen? How did he become very much an Orthodox person? I don't know. I think it would be interesting. You know, we have this image of Berdyaev, who's very much a person who lives in the church, not just somebody who speaks about the mystical church as an outsider, very much as an insider. But I think it's an important question to, and maybe, you know, in our little circle, we could study some of these things and find answers to these questions and to trace this evolution. Thank you. Anna Leva wanted to say a word. Good evening. Yes, indeed. Thank you, everybody. And this is a very interesting discussion, and there's a lot for the future, indeed. And obviously, we need to continue. It would be a shame to stop here. But I'd like to react to the issue, the initial question posed by Dmitry Doroshko about, you know, the way we react to Berdyaev's word. Now, you could obviously talk and argue about it for a long time, but on the other hand, some people like him, some don't. Some people find him inspirational, others don't. And some people say, you know, it's not a clear enough system of philosophical notions and so on and so forth. But on the one hand, you can't really be universally loved. Obviously, somebody's going to dislike what you do or what you say. But there are some things that you need to note, I think, in Berdyaev, particularly, you know, there's a criteria of verification of a theory is its beauty. Not about it being true or working well, but that it is beautiful. And I think when we hear what Berdyaev says about man, about God, about the church, about, you know, the divine and the human, it really takes your breath away. The beauty and the greatness of it. And in the scripture, you know, you have these words that you can judge about certain actions or things in the spirit and by the fruit. But maybe, you know, without delving into the spirit thing, but the fruit. You know, Sophia said, you know, what the sort of this Berdyaev was part of certain movements, of certain brotherhoods, of certain things that happened. And if you look at the quality of these things, and when Michov said to him, when you go to Europe and the West needs to hear your word, it's not just philosophy. It's not just Vatican II. I can remember Nikita Struve speaking about the Antiochian Church and the revival in the Antiochian Church, when there were young Arab students who thought about reviving their church, and the future Metropolitan George Corder and the patriarch, the late patriarch, recently, not for the Antiochian patriarch, his friend, they thought not about, where do you look for life? They felt there was no life left in their own church, and they opened the books by Berdyaev, and it convinced them of the depth of tradition that they were a part of, the tradition of orthodoxy. Obviously, Berdyaev was not an Antiochian thinker, but the depth and the beauty of orthodoxy that they found when they read his word. Berdyaev not being a theologian officially and sort of being a philosopher, but he was able to reveal the depth and the beauty of their own tradition. And it really changed the whole witness of the Antiochian church and so on. And I'm not saying there is not a problem I'm not saying you can't question what he says, but I think there's a very good criteria that you can judge it by. And this is something, some of the evidence that I've brought. Thank you. Father Andre, I think he wants to speak as well. Just switch on your mic.
Okay, thank you. Just a few words. I'm very happy that it is possible to have a meeting like this. So, Sofia, thank you. I think that Berdyaev just gave his life for the church, no? But I think that he wasn't discovered, even though I saw that he was studied a lot. But I think that he's not discovered till now, no? Even though I think that he has a word for today, for the church, for the world, no? So how it is possible to discover him? Just if you're a friend with him. And for me, it is beautiful to see all these people. I think that we are friend, just a small friend of Berdyaev, no? And not just of Berdyaev, also Solovyev, Bulgakov, Komyakov, all of this, no? So I think that Russia didn't say the last word, no? The Russian idea is alive. So I hope that somehow, I don't know how, we can continue, no? Just to know that we think about this thing, we like this thing, no? We think about the church. So thank you.
Спасибо большое, отец Андрей.
Thank you very much indeed, Father Andre. We have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to propose something, even before we finish this discussion. Please propose topics for the future. If you would like to continue, you can write them in the chat, or you can write them later by email, or you can propose them now. And there was one more guest that I wanted to introduce, that we have Harry Casey from Ireland. He's a philosopher, and he represents the Conference of Catholic Bishops in Ireland. If you would like to say a few words, would you like to?
It's lovely to join you this evening, and thank you for inviting me. It was Dimitri that sent me the invitation, and it's lovely to hear the different perspectives. It's a rich conversation and a lot shared there, so thank you very much.
Спасибо, что вы нашли время. Очень рада.
Thank you for finding the time and for joining us. Thank you. Now, we have about 10 minutes left, to be on time. And I'd like to give you a little bit of news, as it were, from this Berdyaev, circle of Berdyaev friends and lovers, Father Andrei called us. Now, I'd like to give my best wishes and congratulations to those who've already completed and defended their thesis. Tonchev, political theology is a very interesting approach, I think, to Berdyaev, and this is something that's important for us, particularly in the crisis that we are going through in our country at the moment. I'd like to congratulate Father Andrei as well, completing his work, his dissertation. We had Tom Willett here for all this time, somebody who has really been a great inspiration to this event. And I think he has a piece of news that he could share, right? Tom, could you? Yeah, just switch on your mic.
Yes, indeed. I should know microphones. I've been in the music business for 40 years. Well, wonderful to see all of you, your faces, hear your voices. I feel like I live and work way off in some hinterland culturally and intellectually, having pursued a career in popular American rock and roll. What in the world am I doing here with all of you? Well, I'll tell you, it was the discovery of the meaning of the creative act that brought together for me the vague sense of hidden parallels between creativity and spirituality that I was running into all of the time in popular music. And yet I'd never heard anyone put it together, express it the way Berdyaev has. And it has changed my life and my career. And you all now are such a part of this. Thank you so much. I'm going to post something in the chat that is an invitation to come to the revitalized Berdyaev discussion group. We moved it from Yahoo to groups.io. And I'm also going to send a link to a new philosophical resource that we call the Nicholas Berdyaev Resource Center, where I've tried to gather so much of the great information that Father Janos, Yakov, Dirk Kelder, and others have had on their individual sites. There's now one place, the Nicholas Berdyaev Resource Center, that one could go to hopefully shorten the distance between a question you may have and a resource that you need. I believe the news that Sophia is graciously mentioned is, again, I was so taken with the meaning of the creative act, the centrality of creativity to what it is to be human, and frankly, what it is to be fully spiritual, that many of my artist friends here in America probably would not have the resilience to plow through even that short book. And so I've attempted to make a briefer version highlighting his main thoughts, and we'll publish that in April, I believe. It initially was going to be called The Concise Meaning of the Creative Act, but I've since considered the title Creativity Will Save the World. Now, of course, that's
Смысл творчества имеется в виду.
to our friends beauty, but the idea of beauty saving the world hit me as too passive. Beauty requires a maker and a auditor or a perceiver, an audience, if you will. And so I've moved it from beauty will save the world to creativity will save the world. And I hope so. I'll keep you posted. Look in the chat in just a moment for the 2 links that I mentioned to the discussion group and the resource center. Thank you so much.
Спасибо, Том.
Thank you, Tom. I've seen what Tom does, actually. I've seen a brochure that, you know, with quotes, you know, for people who are not perhaps philosophers. And I think it's a great idea. And also as a piece of news I'd like to share, I'll put it in the chat as well. There's a new book. It's just a link to a website. St. Philaret's has had sort of roundtable discussions, and I'm part of St. Philaret's, obviously, in the past, been part of it for the past 12 years or so. And in the we had these meetings, there was roundtable discussions in our School of Philosophy, though it is a bit more academic, but those of you who can read in Russian would probably find it interesting. And you can book it online. Now, finally, I am very grateful indeed to all of you who found the time to spend this time together. And I do hope we can continue. I know that Saturday night or morning for some has proved to be a good time for some and not so good, such a good time for others. But I dare say we'll just have to continue by email proposing dates and times. But what would you say at this stage if we had a similar used some Saturday in April? No, some topics have been proposed in the chat here: eschatology, the link to the new martyrs and confessors. There was also a link to Bulgakov. There's friendship with Bulgakov. Anthropology. Yes, I had an idea about anthropology as well. Thank you. On-ground, the non-created freedom. Okay, so if you all have my email, right? Please write back to me. And please react to this idea of, you know, continuing and having another meeting in April. I'd love to have that. And I hope Berdyaev would approve as well. Should I interpret this silence as agreement? No, I'd love to meet again. I'm very much in favor of this idea. Agreed. I support that. Well, if 2 or 3 are gathered together, as we all know, and if Christ is in their midst, yeah, Berdyaev, Khomykov, Dostoevsky. Good, yeah, these are Berdyaev, Khomykov, Vikarayev, Dostoevsky. I think all your tea is all cold at this stage, but thank you all very much again, and let's just say goodbye for now, but hopefully meet again. Thank you all very much indeed. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all, and the organizers in particular. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Спасибо большое. До встречи.
Спасибо, до свидания.
Спасибо, очень интересно было. Хотелось бы продолжить.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I'd love to continue.